Okay, I've got 12 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started while others are hopping on the call. So hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the UNC Injury Prevention Research Center webinar series. My name is Ciara Scott, and I am a project manager here at the Injury Prevention Research Center, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. So just to quickly give you a run of show, we're going to begin today with a quick welcome from Dr. Steve Marshall, who's the director here at the center, and he will be introducing you all to our speakers for today. And then we're going to have our featured presentation followed by some dedicated time for discussion to answer questions that come up for you throughout the presentation. And so before we get started, just for quick housekeeping, I just want to let you all know that right now, I've disabled your mic and camera functions just so that we can protect the quality of our recording from any accidental interruptions. But once we get to the Q&A section of the presentation, you will have the ability to unmute so that you can ask questions and engage directly with the speakers. And throughout the presentation, if questions come up, please feel free to go ahead and start dropping those in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat and collecting those questions so that I can pass them on to the speakers when we get to the Q&A. And so now I'm going to pass the floor to Dr. Steve Marshall, as I said, the director here at the UNC Injury Prevention Research Center.
Thanks a lot, Ciara, and I want to acknowledge the Injury Center's Associate Director, Dr. Beth Morocco, who's also here. Thanks, Beth. And it's a great pleasure to have our guests from Rutgers today. I keep telling people the biggest determinant of today's public health is transportation policy from 2 decades ago, right? Because transportation policy, once you put in concrete, it really sticks around, so where we decide to build roads and how we build roads and how we allocate transportation dollars is a really important determinant of health, not just for current times, but for future times as well. And so we're really excited to have our colleagues from Rutgers today, both an associate professor and a doctoral candidate, to talk about their work, which is focused on how we decide, how we use technology, how we use transportation policy, and how it can be more inclusive and more enlightened going forward. Because it's easy to dwell on past mistakes, but I think we really want to be orientated to a more inclusive and better process going forward. So this seminar series, which I think we're taking a break over the summer, right, Ciara? We've had an incredibly productive spring series. This seminar series is really focused on stimulating interdisciplinary thinking, and I think that's really strongly epitomized by today's speakers who, although they're from school public policy, really, I think in a lot of ways, health and public health is really the focus of their work. So I'll quickly introduce them and then get out of the way. Dr. Kelcie Ralph is an associate professor at the Blouson School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers. And in her research, she looks to identify and correct misconceptions or misperceptions about travel behavior and safety, and to look towards transportation planning policy that's more inclusive. And co-presenting with her is soon-to-be Dr. Angela Johnson Rodriguez, who's a doctoral candidate in planning and public policy at the same university. And she has contributed to a whole series of papers that I've been eagerly reading, along with Dr. Ralph, about reframing automated enforcement of speed and travel policy. And she has a BS in urban policy and regional planning. So I will hand it off to Dr. Ralph, to Kelcie, to take us away. And really look forward to what you guys can share with us.
Thank you for that fantastic introduction. I'm sure Angela is delighted to have had an honorary doctorate degree. All the hard work is done.
Love it.
So let me just say that this work is definitely part of a team effort. Angela and I are here today, but there's also a lot of hard work from Jesus Barajas from UC Davis and our colleagues at Monash University in Australia. So definitely a team effort. And I want to start right away with what our motivation was. So as we look around the world, we know that automated enforcement works really well. The problem is it's not widely used in the United States, and we wanted to see if we could tackle that. And in doing so, we focused on two specific avenues, two reasons that people oppose automated enforcement or sort of opportunities for leveraging new support. And what we did is we surveyed 1,500 US adults. We used some quota sampling and some weighting to make sure that this was representative of the United States. And then we ran an experiment within that survey. I'm happy to talk details of the sort of things your audience is interested in the question and answer session. We talked about two different avenues. So the first I'll talk about was concerns about revenue from ticketing. And the second, which is what Angela will talk about, is concerns about racial justice and the opportunity that racial justice reframing presents, especially during the time that we did this work, which was right at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement. So why do we focus on the revenue side of the question, my work? In survey after survey before our work, it's very clear that in opposing cameras, concerns about revenue predominate. It's the #1 concern listed across countries, across time. And what I'm going to show is it's for good reason, but I'll get into the details of that in just a moment. So that launched us off on this direction. So what we did is we surveyed people and we asked them first, not about cameras, but just about ticketing in general. And the first finding from our study then is that people are really concerned about revenues, not just from cameras, but from ticketing in general. And this is a really troubling fact for those of us interested in safety. 59% of our US respondents said the primary purpose of traffic tickets is to raise revenue, not about safety at all. We had open-ended responses, so people could write in stuff, and they said things like, I hate speed traps. Speed traps are a real problem. Just over and over again, this phrase, speed traps. It's really an idea that has resonated with the public. So that's first. People are concerned about revenue from all ticketing, not just cameras. And I want to sort of return to this literature for just a second to say they have very good reason to be skeptical. So 86% of US cities use some sort of ticketing for fines. Some cities use quite a bit. So nationwide, let's see, $16 billion in 2019 came from fines. Chicago's the big city with the most amount of fines. 4% of the Chicago budget comes from fines. But some cities have even more. So the example that we include in our paper is Georgetown, Louisiana. Fully 92% of their budget comes from fines. That's an extreme case, but many cities across the US can collect a considerable amount of money from tickets. The next thing I want to say is that cities, there's very good evidence from this woman named Sue in California, who cities respond to a budget shortfall in 1 year with more ticketing in the next year. So this is just really clear evidence that this is a source of revenue, not about safety necessarily. And then the final thing is that there's really deep equity concerns here. So cities that have a larger percentage of Black or Hispanic population see a much larger share of their revenue coming from tickets. So all of this combined means that cities are responding to their budget pressures by ramping up enforcement and collecting money from their residents and from people traveling through their areas. And the public is frustrated by that. Speed traps are something that resonate with them. So that's the foundation. The next thing we did is we said, what's the relationship between your thoughts about ticketing and your thoughts about cameras specifically? And so we've created this sort of direct association between revenue concerns and opposition to cameras. Cities and towns do this practice. The public views it as a source of revenue. And then folks who think tickets are about revenue are more likely to oppose cameras. It's this direct relationship, and it makes quite a bit of sense. But we also found this indirect relationship. So folks who think that tickets are about revenue are less trusting of their local government. They're also more concerned about government interference. Now, just as a quick aside, as a methodologist, we don't have causality here. This could go either direction, but there is an association here. So we can also talk about that in the Q&A. But public sees tickets as a source of revenue, less stressed, more concerned about government interference. And then those in turn are associated with more opposition to automated enforcement. So we've created sort of a really tough spot for us as policymakers. The good news, there's good news, is that cameras address these concerns from the public. So the first thing is that cameras are a horrible source of long-term revenue because people start to comply with the rules and there's very low recidivism rates. So let's see, revenues begin to fall over time. The second issue is, remember I said that enforcement would get ramped up whenever there's budget pressure. Cameras already run 24 hours a day. You can't ramp them up in response to a budget need. And so there's just sort of constant enforcement all the time. And then the third thing is not about cameras per se, but about the institutional framework that cameras are operating within. Most camera revenue goes specifically for safety improvements, not to the police or the general fund. So altogether, those things sort of directly address the public's concerns about revenue. So if we told people that, would they sort of like cameras more? That's the big question we're interested in here. And to find out, we conducted an experiment, an honest to God experiment, where one group read a treatment message that said, here's your concerns about revenue, we hear you, here's how cameras address those concerns. The other group was randomly assigned to read a control message that said, here's how cameras would work. We didn't mention any of the concerns about revenue at all. So 2 different groups, 2 different messages. And the great news is that this revenue frame increased support for cameras. So folks who read that treatment message, 77% of them approved of automated enforcement in their community. The full text of the question is down at the bottom. Whereas only 57% of people who read that control message, just the basics of cameras, only 57% of them approved. So a pretty dramatic increase in support. Now, we've not included all of the details here, but this finding held when we controlled for personal characteristics, when we controlled for beliefs about policing, feelings about government intervention, all of that. So this is a really robust finding and stayed about this magnitude and size as well. So revenue reframe works to increase support. I'm going to hand it off to Angela, who will talk about the racial justice frame.
All right, thank you, Kelcie. So yeah, I will just talk a bit about our racial justice reframe. The reason why we decided to go with a racial justice reframe here for looking at automated enforcement was because of honestly what was happening just in the United States at the time. We were seeing sort of the apex of racial injustice happening around 2020, which of course, as we all saw, ended up having the protest for racial justice that also occurred around summer of that same year. We also wanted to look at this particular reframe because, as we've learned through our literature review here, that the usual way that drivers interact with the police is through traffic stops. And what we were seeing is that traffic stops were producing very deadly outcomes disproportionately for people of color, but especially for Black drivers. So with this understanding that there's a lot of apprehension from drivers in their interactions with police, even when it comes to just traffic safety, we want to know, okay, so how can cameras maybe change our idea of what traffic enforcement could look like? Ooh, and I don't have control. Can I? Okay, thank you. So we also use this, we also use a similar experiment here to look at what a racial justice reframe would look like. So in our treatment message for these respondents who received it, we wanted them to look at a message that addressed policing concerns using cameras. And then those who were just in the control group, they just received a message about how cameras worked. And that was just kind of it. And we saw, just as we did with the revenue reframe, that a racial justice frame did in fact increase support for cameras. We saw that of the respondents, 77% of the respondents who received this particular reframe, this particular treatment, were actually more supportive of cameras after receiving it, even though people who also were in that control group were also coming in as quite supportive. And that's actually a point here that I really do want to make, is that our respondents of the survey were actually quite supportive of traffic cameras. We were coming in thinking that, oh my goodness, people are going to just hate traffic cameras because of all of the reasons that we think about, right? Privacy, safety, all of these things, but people were actually quite supportive of cameras. And so, and our findings showed just that. But of course, as we know, messaging is not enough. If the world ran on just positive messaging, maybe we'd be a completely different world. However, we know that that's just not going to be it in order to really change hearts and minds, especially when it comes to policy, and especially as it comes to maybe some deep-seated beliefs, and also how we've been treated on the road. So we come up with six recommendations here, just some quick takeaways that could help us in trying to understand how to really change people's ideas towards traffic cameras. So our first one here is to set reasonable fines. And this is actually coming out of our respondents. We received 400 qualitative responses, which is really fun to just like scroll through on the after the end of the survey. But fines were a really big point for people. And this is because many respondents were saying that they believe that there was an unfairness that was inherently a part of receiving traffic fines, and that was due to the scale of how you receive them. Someone who was going to have a much lower income, getting a $200 fine really hurts, versus someone who makes $200,000, that's maybe just a blip in the piggy bank, right? So setting reasonable fines, maybe even fines that are proportional to your income, may start to change behavior on the road. And as a coupling to our first one here, also this could be a way to target repeat offenders. So one way that we have seen in the literature is that some cities could make a driver's first ticket maybe inexpensive, and then as a driver racks up fines over time, they can start to increase as a way to change their behavior. Our third one here is going to be about spending revenue on safety. So we also saw in from our respondents that they were having questions about, where is revenue going to be spent? Okay, we're saving money by having cameras. Now, how are you going to be putting that money back into the community? So one way here that we've seen is we could have self-enforcing streets. These are ways that the built environment is redesigned as ways to cue people into slowing down as they approach intersections, slowing down as they approach residential areas, just as a way to start to change people's behavior without the use of enforcement, because enforcement can often be punitive. So our fourth one here will be to also locate cameras carefully. And I would argue this was probably one of the points from our respondents that was a big sticking point. Many of our respondents are very much afraid of cameras being used as a way to just re-entrench the same sort of surveillance that we already see from traffic enforcement, but just moving it from a person now to a camera. And now they're also afraid of cameras being disproportionately placed in communities of color, due to these being also areas that have high crash corridors, these also being areas where they are just like wider streets due to implicit bias. So yes, we need to locate cameras in areas where there are high crash corridors, but we also need to think about this through a lens of justice and equity, and also involve the community. Fifth, let's also consider how they're going to be operated. So this question here is really just a broader question that we have in regards to, who's going to be in charge of the cameras. If we start to move them away from the person-operated form of traffic enforcement to a camera form of traffic enforcement, should these cameras still be operated by the police? Should it be an independent entity? Who is going to be really in charge of this here? That's a little bit outside of the scope of our work, but we know that this is definitely a question here that still needs a bit more thought, especially on behalf of policymakers. And then finally, we need to design effective contracts. Cities have to really drill down with the public and really convince them that these camera contracts are for traffic safety. They are designed on behalf of the people who are driving, people who are walking, people who are biking. They're designed for the people who live in these cities, not just to, as many of our respondents said, just to raise money and to use it for whatever. And so we believe that policymakers should really craft contracts and that ensure that these revenues will be based on the cost of operating the cameras rather than the number of tickets collected, and be able to then go back to, we have their number 3, spend those revenue on safety measures that are going to actually benefit communities who need it most.
Great, thanks, Angela. I'm going to end with one last note, which is, if we make this switch to cameras effectively, we want to be really concerned that it might exacerbate the financial pressures that I mentioned at the outset. Cities are going to have to turn somewhere for revenue, and unfortunately, the place they're going is actually forfeitures, civil forfeitures. So the taking of personal property as part of like a drug bust. And so we really need to keep our eye on that issue as well, given that we're concerned about equity. Here is where you can learn more. This was like the very quick and dirty version, and we're so happy to answer more questions. I will put a link to these papers in the chat so folks can access it. But we're willing and able to take questions.
I think I saw a couple pop up.
Yeah, thank you all so much for that presentation. Very, very interesting work. And we do have questions in the chat, so I'll start with those. If anybody else has questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, or you can use the raise hand feature, and I'll call on you to just ask your question out loud. But to start with the questions in the chat, the first one from Bruce, he says, as to the revenue reframe, could you give an example of how you might have phrased that? Were you focusing on the revenue stream, which he thought would increase opposition to automated speed sensors?
Great. And I'm Bruce, it's almost like you read my mind. Here's the full text of the message. We knew that folks here would probably be detailed oriented. So very big picture, it does 3 things. It says, look, we hear you. We're taking your concerns about revenue seriously. The second paragraph was the same for all of the messages. It just explains how cameras would work. And then third, showed how cameras addressed that concern. And so I think Bruce's question was in part about how it would be spent. The very last line of this message says, in this case, the revenues would be spent on safety. It could not be used for the police or other city priorities. Of course, the details of that implementation might vary from city to city, but this is best practices, is to make sure it's for safety.
Awesome. And then we have another question from Bruce. He said, can you speak a bit on the current status of traffic light cameras in North Carolina? When they were first installed, there was a big backlash and a lot were removed, but he's noticed their number has increased recently.
So I can't talk about UNC, but let me talk about, or North Carolina, but I can talk about Alaska, which is where I'm from. So Alaska got speed cameras, and the contract was so poorly written that the camera company made more money every single time they wrote a ticket. I think 75% of the revenue, if I'm recalling correctly. And in a court case, the judge said, look, you have an interest in writing more tickets. We're not going to take any of your evidence in court. And so they threw out every single traffic camera that was challenged. And this led to such backlash within Anchorage that the public did a referendum to make sure that we could never have cameras again. And so that's why I want to be really clear that the details of implementation matter so much. Most people don't go to planning school or policy school to practice writing contracts, but it is essential for this to work. But I'm glad to hear that North Carolina went through a sort of resurgence, that it's legally possible to add more cameras back in. That's heartening.
All right, we have another question from Becky Nauman. She's asking, can you speak a bit to the framing that might be used or how it might differ for the public versus policymakers? And do you tend to do different experiments around this or think about it differently or no?
Such a good question. So we're sort of working with a convenient sample in a way here. It is very easy for us to get our hands on a group of the public who are willing to take surveys. It is much more difficult, as you can imagine, to get policymakers who might be willing to take a survey or to do an experiment. But I think we can still draw some lessons here for convincing policymakers that this is a good idea. And I think beyond the things that Angela has already laid out, I would encourage policymakers to do cameras as a trial, as a pilot program early in their tenure, as quickly as possible, because there is a lot of hate right before it goes in. Immediately after, people are getting tickets, they're unhappy, but then this sort of miraculous thing happens. Most drivers start complying with the law, and most drivers start seeing benefits, that there are safer schoolyards and there are safer driveways and the like. So trial it, do it early. Also, I just want to echo what Angela said. Actually, a lot of people support cameras. And this was true when we went back into the literature. They support cameras, but there's a very small, but very, very vocal set of opposition who, famously now in France is out there destroying the cameras in the cover of darkness. So that's something to keep in mind.
Okay, that was actually, there's another question. Are there any states that are success stories or have done this well?
I can think of, well, we leaned a lot on the school camera, at least the school cameras that were placed around, we leaned a lot on the cameras that were placed in school zones in New York City. And that was so there were perimeters set up around public schools in New York City as a way to slow down drivers, as they were seeing that there were many traffic crashes that were happening with pedestrians. And that actually did start to change driver behavior. And that school zone pilot, which I think was back in 2014, was basically the background for the camera program that they have today. So that is one. And a second one right now is the one that's happening in Philly, which actually has quite a bit of support. Ton of backlash at first, of course, as always. But I think they're actually set to expand it onto Roosevelt Avenue, if they haven't already, which is one of the corridors in Philadelphia, which has the greatest amount of crashes. So
and I'll just add that this is part of an international collaboration. Two of our co-authors are from Monash University in Australia, where cameras are everywhere and it's just sort of a done thing. And so that having that perspective within the team was really useful.
Awesome. We actually have another question from Steve. So he commended your work, but I'm going to skip to the question. And it's for you, Angela. He wants to know, are there racial differences between respondents in the response to the framing of camera as a justice issue?
Yes, so that was actually a question that we had as the researchers. This is 2021, we did this survey, but it's still in a bit of a national crisis. How are people of different races and ethnicities going to react to the fact that we're talking about a frame that is centering racial justice? Will there be backlash? And we saw absolutely no backlash whatsoever, which was just very heartwarming. Yeah, no. Across the board, white, Black, Latinx, including all ethnicity, Asian and Native American, there was just round support for the uses of the uses of cameras to reduce police driver interaction, which was just disproportionately hurting people of color. So yeah, in our survey, we saw no racial differences there. We saw just across the board support.
We also looked at variation across political ideology because that seemed really important as well. And at worst, it didn't work. The message just simply didn't work. At best, it worked very well. And so we were worried about backlash, as Angela mentioned, and we just didn't see any evidence of backlash at all.
Thank you all so much. We are at time, so I just want to jump in to just quickly just let you all know in the chat, I've dropped the link to our post-evaluation survey. If you have time to fill that out, we would greatly appreciate it. I'll also be sending a follow-up email that'll include that, and I'll have the contact information for Dr. Ralph and Angela if you would like to follow up. And as Steve mentioned, this is going to be our last webinar for this current round of our series. So we're going to take a break during the summer and we'll return in the fall. So please look out for more information from us about the next round of this webinar series. Thank you again, Dr. Ralph and Angela, so much, such a great presentation. And there was one more question in the chat. So I don't know if you all are able to stay on just to answer that, but if not, I can get you connected with that person via email. So let me know what you prefer.
And Ciara, I'd just like to also give a giant shout out to Ciara Scott, because he has done such a fabulous job organizing this webinar series. We weren't sure, we didn't know if people were sick of, being on Zoom, and, we kind of played around with the length, but it's just been a great success. And a lot of the reason, in addition to our wonderful speakers, has been the great organization, Ciara. So thank you.
Thank you, Beth. All right. So awesome. Thank you all for being willing to stay on, and let me find the question. Lots of thank yous and praise to you all in the chat. Awesome. Okay, so this question is from Tracy Russ, and she wants to know, is there a noticeable difference in acceptance based on camera location? And she says, I'm assuming cameras around school zones receive more support.
Angela, do you want to take this one or do you want me?
There is a perfect article that actually gets at this question.
Yeah.
It's an article from 2011, but it's like, yeah. So yeah, cameras around school zones do in fact have the greatest amount of support. If I'm not mistaken, it was cameras that were around highways that had the least amount of support. But still overall, and I mean 60% of respondents to that particular survey were still very much in favor of automated enforcement. And let me go ahead and find that, and if Kelcie wants to elaborate.
Yeah, I don't remember who it was, but you're so right. There's exactly the question that you asked, is where's the level of support? But everywhere had the lowest support of all. I do remember that.
Yeah.
And that if you name specific locations, high crash locations, tons of support. Schools, tons of support. But yeah, it's in the citations for the race paper.
It definitely is. And their surname starts with an M.
Don't you hate that? You're like, and it's on the top left of the page, guaranteed. But
Well, thank you all so much. And I'll include the links to the papers that you sent in the chat in the follow-up email.
fantastic. This was such a pleasure, and the organization was seamless. So props to you, Ciara. This was incredible.
Oh, no, thank you all again. I'm really appreciative of you joining us. All right,
Well,
bye, everyone.
Graduation.
Thank you, Steve.
Bye.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, Kelcie.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed it. And thank you, Ciara.